Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Richard Edwards aho. Welcome to our Department of Public Health Friday seminar series. It's my great pleasure to be chairing and introducing Jude for today's talk, which is on sex, drugs, smoke and booze, what's driving teen trends, which sounds like a pretty good meaty title. So Jude is a PhD student in the department. She has a background in psychology, has a master's in critical psychology, and she's also done a diploma of public health. And since we've got all this stuff on about our diploma, she is an excellent advertisement for our diploma in public health. Jude came to us with a PhD idea it was about 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. What we often say with PhDs is do something reasonably constrained, and make sure that you can complete and finish this PhD, and there's not too many. It's not too broad and too ambitious. And Jude ignored all of that, and has done a very ambitious and very interesting and broadly focused PhD, and she's carried it off brilliantly. So I think she really is one of our outstanding PhD students, of whom we have many. So it's my really great pleasure to introduce Jude, and I'm very much looking forward to what she's got to say. So, Jude.
Kia ora koutou, and thanks for the introduction, Richard. I am a final year PhD student, and I think from what I hear, often people are getting a little bit sick of their topic by year 3. But I'm happy to say that I'm still really fascinated by this question of what's driving teen trends. And I think that's partly because I don't know what the answers are yet. But it's my privilege today to share with you what I have found so far. So thanks for the opportunity to come and speak. As some of you know, I started in the department as a research fellow before embarking on my PhD, and my role then was in the Aspire Tobacco Control Group, mainly progressing research ideas that Richard came up with but didn't have time to carry out himself. And one of those ideas he suggested I look at was why adolescent smoking was declining. He said there's been this massive decline in all English-speaking countries. Nobody knows why. And I thought to myself, pretty obvious, isn't it? Governments, health promoters are doing everything they can to try and prevent young people from smoking, and it's working. But anyway, I did go away and have a look into it. And of course, Richard was right, I was wrong. And actually, it's not nearly as obvious as it at first appears. So taking a look at smoking, this is prevalence of regular smoking in early adolescence in the USA, New Zealand, Australia and England. And I should say all of these slides I'm going to show you are taken from nationally representative surveys of secondary school students. But the questions they use and the age ranges they use are slightly different. So the comparability is not perfect, but it gives you a sense of the general shape of the trends. So as you can see, is this pointer thing going to work? Oh, here we go. Working? Cool. As you can see, there was an almost simultaneous rise in smoking in teenagers in the 90s, followed by a really sharp decline in the early 2000s. So in the US, this big rise here is generally thought to be due to direct marketing by the tobacco industry, targeting advertising at teenagers very deliberately. And at the same time, there was a real drop in the price of cigarettes. So relative to other goods, tobacco became cheaper. So that's how they explain that in America. But what's really curious is that neither of those explanations hold in Australia or New Zealand. We'd already banned tobacco advertising by the 90s, and we didn't see a fall in tobacco prices then. So as you can see in Australia, the price of tobacco pretty much doubled between 1990 and 1998. So during this period when smoking was going up, prices were going up too. And similarly, for the decline in the early 2000s, in the US, again, often that's put down to price. But in New Zealand, we had no tax increases between 2000 and 2010. Prices were pretty much flatlining, and yet our adolescent smoking rates were declining massively. So what's going on? Even in the US, where price does explain some of the change, research suggests it only explains a small proportion of the change in teen smoking. In one of very few studies that have been done on this issue, some economists, Pampel and Aguila, tested a range of possible explanations. And they found that most of them made little or no contribution to the trend. Price did make a difference, but only in the latter years, and they concluded that much of the change in youth smoking remains unexplained. So it's an unsolved mystery. But what's even more mysterious is the decline in adolescent drinking. So contrary to the impression that you might get from the media, the proportion of adolescents who don't drink alcohol at all has almost doubled in all 4 countries over the past, well, since 2000. Now, I just happened to stumble across a paper about non-drinking in adolescents while I was looking at the tobacco issue. And that really got me curious. I thought, well, what else is going on with teen behaviour? And it turns out that binge drinking, surprise, surprise, has also declined over the past 15 years. In the population as a whole, as you can see here, the adolescent population, and among adolescent drinkers. So evidence suggests that although binge drinking is still prevalent, especially in New Zealand and England, young drinkers are drinking less frequently, and on average they're drinking less per session than they were in the 1990s. So are they taking drugs instead? Well, no. Lifetime use of illicit drugs has also gone down, beginning its decline in the late 90s at the same time that tobacco started declining. You probably have heard that teen pregnancy has gone down. It's declined incredibly. I mean, it's a staggering decline in the US over 25 years. And note particularly this, does it work? Where are we? This really sharp decline since about 2008 in all 4 countries. And over this period, adolescent abortion has also been declining at a similar rate. So media reports about record lows in teen pregnancy usually put it down to better sex education or better contraception. And it is possible that people who are using contraception are using more effective methods as they come onto the market. But the proportion who are not using contraception at all the last time they had sex has actually gone up since 2000. The proportion not using condoms has also gone up in recent years, which is a bit of a worry from a public health perspective. So if contraception hasn't improved, then young people must be having less sex, right? And indeed, that does seem to be what's going on. So with younger adolescents in particular, less likely to report ever having sex. There's evidence from a number of countries that the age of first intercourse, which reached record lows in the 90s, has started to rise again since. And fewer secondary school students are sexually active these days at any point in time. So in summary, the 12 to 15-year-olds of today are way less likely to smoke, they're less likely to drink, take drugs, or have sex than teenagers of the 1990s. So there's something going on here, right? But what's interesting is that although this international phenomenon has been going on for over a decade now, it's not really even recognised as a thing in the literature, let alone researched or explained. So as far as I know, I'm the first person to compile all this data to get a sense of the parameters of this trend. So where are the boundaries? It's not only sexual behaviour and substance use. Juvenile crime is also going down, as is delinquency, including physical fighting and truancy. Road safety is also improved internationally, and particularly in this age group, although we have seen a bit of a reversal in New Zealand since 2013. So is this just a coincidence, or is it all part of the same pattern? Does it suggest perhaps that adolescents are getting happier and healthier in general? Unfortunately, no, because there's a bunch of other indicators that are not improving. Obesity and nutrition haven't improved, physical activity rates are getting worse, and there are indicators that mental health may be declining, particularly anxiety and self-harm prevalence seem to be going up, particularly in young girls. And the fact that mental health is going in the opposite direction from risk behaviour is really surprising, because a lot of the shared risk factors are common to both. So things like having problems in family relationships at home, having a history of sexual abuse or neglect, disconnection from school, witnessing family violence. These are all risk factors for both mental health problems and risk behaviour. So it's really surprising that they're heading off in different directions. Thinking geographically, these trends are common to most, but not all, high-income countries. So there are places like Italy, for example, where substance use has not declined at all. In Denmark, where binge drinking is incredibly high and is not declining. They're kind of bucking this general trend. So it's a big mystery, and it's become my doctoral topic. And as Richard mentioned, looking at my original thesis aim now to describe and explain trends in adolescent risk behaviour seems extremely ambitious, naively ambitious. And I just want to say up front that there is no simple explanation. So I'll need to retrofit a more kind of realistic aim, I think, that talks about, making some small contribution to understanding what's going on with young people. But anyway, my thesis is looking at changes in adolescent risk behaviour, particularly smoking, alcohol use, marijuana use, and sexual behaviour. And I'm particularly looking at the under 16 age group. And there's two reasons for that. One is because there's good evidence, strong evidence base, that starting risk behaviours earlier in life, so in childhood or early adolescence, is associated with greater long-term risk than starting at, say, 17 or 18. The other reason is much more pragmatic, is that most of these surveys that I'm using are based in schools, and up to the school leaving age. That's a pretty representative sample of adolescents in general, but beyond the school leaving age, it's not. So to avoid that methodological complication, I'm looking at the younger age group. And looking at this question, it's really important to be aware of what's going on developmentally for people in this age group, and how the wider social context impacts on the experience of transitioning from childhood to adulthood. So there's no specific age that we consider to be adolescence, but it's generally agreed to be the period between puberty at one end and achievement of adult roles or milestones at the other. So obviously that's very context dependent. So depending on which historical period, which culture, which class you belong to, those adult roles are going to look pretty different, and the experience of adolescence is going to be pretty different. But there are developmental tasks that are more or less universal and that need to be achieved for successful transition into adulthood. So I've listed them up there. So it's basically the task of an adolescent is to untie the apron strings and become your own person. Figure out what to do with the new look body that you end up with and the strange urges that it brings about, and preparing for adult roles, whatever they may look like. figuring out what the world's about and where you fit in. So in epidemiological terms, risk refers to increased probability of illness, injury, or death. But the risk in adolescent risk behaviour, which is a term not coined by epidemiologists, it comes from developmental psychology. The risk in adolescent risk behaviour refers not only to physical risks, but also psychosocial risks. So it's about the risk of not making that transition successfully. And there's a paradox here, because it's developmentally normal, healthy even, for young people to experiment, to challenge rules, to have fun with their friends. And often substance use, sexual experimentation can be part of that, which is not to say that sexual experimentation and substance use are risk-free, but from a young person's point of view, they serve a purpose. But when risk behaviour becomes extreme or is driven by distress, for example, in young people experiencing abuse or neglect, then risky substance use or sexual behaviour can interfere with healthy development, and it can become part of a negative spiral. So in public health, we don't really distinguish between these two different types of risk behaviour, but maybe we should. So just to outline what I'm trying to do in my thesis, and also briefly in this talk today, the first is to describe trends and patterns in risk behaviour. So we've already done most of that. Secondly, describe the changing social context for adolescents. And thirdly, to explore and test explanatory hypotheses for the decline in risk behaviour. So we've covered trends and patterns already, but just to recap and think about the implications for what might be driving these trends. It's notable that trends are strikingly similar across countries, and that tends to suggest some kind of underlying common drivers. But on the other hand, the timing of the turning point for different behaviours, for example, tobacco and marijuana is late 90s, whereas for alcohol it was early to mid 2000s. The fact that there's different timings suggests that there isn't one single trigger. So it's possible there might be both common underlying drivers and tobacco-specific, alcohol-specific, sex-specific factors. Something else that's really interesting about these patterns is that there are almost simultaneous declines in all socioeconomic and ethnic groups, which I'll just give you an example here. These graphs show marijuana, the proportion who have never used marijuana in New Zealand secondary school students. So as you can see, and note that the axis starts at 35, not 0, because most young people have never used marijuana. So the proportion of never users goes up over time for all groups, but it goes up most for Māori and students from low decile schools. So the differences, ethnic and socioeconomic differences, are narrowing over time. We would see a very similar picture if we looked at tobacco use in adolescents, but it's quite different from what's going on in adults. So this simultaneous decline across demographic groups, it's quite unusual, and it tends to suggest environmental drivers that influence the whole population at the same time, rather than fashions or health messages that tend to get through to one group and then gradually diffuse through the other groups in society. And the final point I want to make in relation to trends and patterns is that what's going on for adolescents and young adults seems to be different from what's going on for adults, at least with regards to substance use. So looking at alcohol, for example, historically, adolescent alcohol use has tended to rise and fall in concert with what's going on in the population as a whole. But about a decade ago, these trends started to diverge. So for example, looking in New Zealand, this is New Zealand Health Survey data, for 15 to 17-year-olds and 18 to 24-year-olds, hazardous drinking has gone down over time, over the last decade. Whereas when we look at older age groups, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, 45 to 54, hazardous drinking is actually going up. This might be a surprise to you because the media framing of alcohol is very much as a youth issue. But as you can see with the blue line at the bottom, 15 to 17-year-olds are actually the group least likely to be hazardous drinkers. As Malcolm Harris has said, moral panics about youth behaviour are a historical constant, but now they are especially unmoored from reality. Okay, so I'd like now to move on to the next topic, which is to talk very briefly, I'll make it very brief, about the context for adolescence. So there have been really big social changes over the last 30-odd years. That means the experience of adolescence has changed. So for example, thanks to globalisation and the neoliberal turn in the 1980s, the youth labour market has virtually collapsed over the past 30 years. In the 1980s, it was normal to leave school at 15 or 16 and get a job, but it's become increasingly more impossible. And as a result, school retention has increased a lot between 1990 and today. And governments around the world have been raising the school leaving age to stem the tide of youth unemployment. So for example, in England, it's now compulsory to be in full-time educational training until 18 years of age. And that's the case in a lot of countries in Europe. That's been brought in since the global financial crisis. So it means that the milestones of leaving education, getting a job, leaving home are happening much later in life, especially as tertiary education is now seen as more necessary and more expensive. Another consequence is that secondary school students are less likely to have a part-time job than they were. And this means they have less financial independence than teens in past decades. In terms of culture and norms, between 1990 and now, parents have become markedly older and better educated. Families have become smaller, and time-use studies suggest that parents, both mothers and fathers, are spending more time with their children than in the 1960s. Corporal punishment was outlawed in schools in New Zealand in the 1980s and in homes a little bit later, and this suggests a cultural shift away from authoritarianism. We can also see big changes in age-related norms. It's only a generation ago that 5- and 6-year-olds walked to school by themselves, unaccompanied by adults, and played in the streets in the neighbourhoods without anyone actively supervising them. As I said, 15 or 16 was the normal age to leave school and get a job, and getting married and starting a family at 18 or 19 was perfectly normal. So we've seen big shifts there. In terms of innovation, I guess the obvious thing to mention is the digital transformation. So the internet and then more recently social media and smartphones have changed how children and teens entertain themselves and how they socialise. So collectively, these and other changes have made a big difference to what it means to be an adolescent and how adolescents feel for young people. So on to the final section, I'm just going to present to you quite rapidly 8 different hypotheses for what might be going on with young people. So thinking about those social changes gives us quite a few ideas about what might be going on. So perhaps the most obvious and attractive hypothesis for us in the public health sector is that what we're doing as public health people is working. The message has got through, job done. And certainly there is some evidence, particularly in the tobacco area and also alcohol taxation and mass media campaigns, there is evidence that some of these interventions have made a difference at the population level. But where the evidence exists, and it is pretty limited, effect sizes are generally pretty small, We see similar trends in countries with and without interventions. So an example there is that in England, they've had a teen pregnancy strategy, which has timed with that very steep decline in teen pregnancy from about 2008. And of course, they're stoked because their strategies worked, right? But we don't have a strategy in New Zealand, and we've seen exactly the same decline. So was it the strategy, or is it something else going on? Another question arises, if it's about the message finally getting through, then why is it these substance use and sexual abstinence messages and not the contraception and the nutrition and the physical activity messages that are getting through? And why more impact on adolescents than adults? So I think we can conclude that public health has definitely played a role, but it doesn't completely explain what we're seeing in teen behaviour. So could the changes we're seeing in this slice of secondary school age teens be simply that they're initiating risk behaviour beyond the age that we're surveying them? So rather than starting at 14 or 15, they're starting at 17 or 18. And I've put just in inverted commas because if that is what's happening, that is an awesome outcome in itself and means that long-term harm is definitely going to be lower. And in fact, there is consistent evidence that the age of initiation has increased for tobacco, alcohol, cannabis, and sexual intercourse. So that's great news for public health. But is that all that's going on, or are some of those changes being carried through into adulthood? There is emerging evidence from Australia of a cohort effect, at least for alcohol, suggesting that young people, even as they reach early adulthood, they're still less likely to drink and still not drinking as much as older cohorts. Why? Well, it's possible that the achievement of adult roles, which is stretching out into the 20s, and the limitations on youngsters who are no longer allowed to walk to school by themselves or play outside by themselves, maybe that's changed what we expect of that kind of 14 to 15-year-old age group. Maybe we're looking at them and they're looking at themselves less as budding adults and more as children. Maybe. That's speculative. But if it was just... sorry, I said that already. Okay, so in conclusion, it seems that yes, delayed initiation is definitely a big part of what's going on. We don't know yet whether that is going to carry through to adulthood or not. We'll have to wait and see for that one. Another idea is that healthy has become cool. And I think we can reject this one pretty quickly, because if healthy was cool, then why isn't nutrition and physical activity getting better? So, okay. Number 4, have adolescents become more risk-averse? This is quite a popular idea. We live in a risk-saturated society, but this is actually something that was looked at in the Monitoring the Future study in the US. They asked questions about risk preference, asking whether young people get a kick out of doing things that are a little dangerous or like to test themselves by doing things that are a bit risky. And this graph here shows from 1975 through to 2011. But you can see the bit we're interested in, more towards the end from 2000, there hasn't been a decline in risk preference. If anything, young people are keener to do things that are a little bit dangerous than they used to be. So that seems pretty unlikely. Perhaps the most popular hypothesis is that smartphones and social media have displaced risk behaviour. And on the face of it, this seems like a really plausible idea. It fits with the international nature of the trends. It fits with the decline in mental health and physical activity. There's a plausible mechanism, because if young people are busy virtually socialising on their screens, then A, they're probably getting together with their friends physically less often, so there's less chance to pass around the cigarette or whatever. And possibly it means that those traditional risk behaviours look less attractive because there's this incredibly fun, engaging other thing you can do with your friends. But there are a few problems with this hypothesis. The first is that the decline started long before smartphones or social media. So this is our study period here, and you'll recall that the biggest declines were happening around here, long before smartphones came along. And social media, it's been around for a while, but it really took off around 2008, which does time with that massive decline in teen pregnancy. So it's not just about smartphones, but maybe it's about the digital revolution more generally. And when we look at the graph of this blue line sticking up in the air, this is the proportion of 3 to 17-year-olds in the US with home internet. And it does time in quite nicely with that decline in smoking and alcohol use in the US. Okay, but there's another problem. If digital media is having a protective effect, then we'd expect that high internet use will be associated with low likelihood of risk behaviour in adolescents. But research indicates the exact opposite. So there's a growing body of research from a wide range of countries using a bunch of different measures of digital media exposure, and they all have consistent findings. The higher young people's exposure to digital media, the higher their likelihood of substance use. Interesting. There's some pretty obvious confounders that haven't been adjusted for in any of these studies though. One is sociability. It makes sense that highly sociable young people are going to be on their phones a lot and maybe more likely to smoke and drink and take drugs. Another is parental permissiveness. So the parents that don't put limits around screen time maybe are pretty relaxed about substance use as well. So maybe if we controlled for those confounders, the relationship would disappear or reverse. But as it stands, there's a lack of evidence of a protective effect. There's another problem. If increasing digital media use causes a decline in risk behaviour, then we would expect to see a decline in risk behaviour in every country in which the digital revolution has happened. But what about our outliers? What about Denmark and Italy? Those Italian young people, they love their digital media as much as young people anywhere, and yet Italian teens are smoking just as much as ever. Their binge drinking has gone up, and their marijuana use has gone up quite a lot. So clearly, it can't be a direct causal relationship between digital media use going up and adolescent risk behaviour coming down, because that's not what's happening in Italy. So maybe it's a more complex relationship. So in summary, I'm not quite willing to throw out this hypothesis, but at the moment, there's a real lack of supporting evidence. And unfortunately, the data that's available to me doesn't allow me to really explore this hypothesis much further. But what I have been able to do is look at some of the shared risk and protective factors that are associated with a range of risk behaviours and test whether they've contributed to the decline in risk behaviour in New Zealand. So the first thing I've looked at is parental monitoring. And by the way, the data I'm using is from the Youth 2000 study, which is 3 secondary school cohort studies in 2001, 2007, 2012. So it enables us to look at changes over time. And as discussed, parenting's changed. And there's international evidence that parents are keeping a closer eye on their teens. So is that going on in New Zealand too? Young people in the Youth 2000 are asked, does your family want to know where you are and who you're with? And those who replied always have gone up slightly over time. There has been an increase, particularly in low decile students. So is there a relationship between parental monitoring and risk behaviour? So we calculated odds ratios to look at that. And as you would expect, those whose parents only usually, sometimes or hardly ever wanted to know where their young people were more likely to be substance users. So the parental monitoring is going up, there's a strong relationship. Does it explain the trends? So one way we can look at that is by calculating an odds ratio for year. So compared to 2001, here's my pointer gone, compared to the reference 2001, in 2007, young people were only 48% as likely to use tobacco. And in 2012, it had gone down to 20%. So this model includes age, ethnicity, school decile. So what we can do is add parental monitoring to that model. And if this number gets closer to 1, that suggests that parental monitoring is explaining some of that change over time. So we did that. And it does change in the direction that you would expect, but with very much overlapping confidence intervals. So that suggests there is a change, but it's not statistically significant. It could have just been by chance. Same for marijuana, same for binge drinking. So parental monitoring, promising hypothesis, but it looks like it's really not a big factor in New Zealand anyway. I'm just going to race through this because the outcome is the same. The idea is that school attachment and aspirations might be making a difference. The proportion who feel that they belong at school and the proportion who think they're treated fairly has improved, and aspirations to complete school have gone up. There's a strong relationship between those factors and risk-taking, but when we look at the trend analysis, it's making what looks like a small difference, but it's not statistically significant for any of those risk behaviours. So it doesn't seem to be much to do with school factors either. What about attitudes to substance use? So young people ask, which of these do you think it's okay for people your age to use regularly? And as you can see, there's been a huge change over time in the proportion who think it's okay to use tobacco, alcohol, and to a lesser degree, marijuana. But this question, of course, it packs together what young people think is age appropriate with what they think about that particular substance. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at what's going on for the 16 and over group. And as you can see here, if we just look at the green bars, maybe is least confusing, there's a big change in the proportion who think that alcohol is okay. So alcohol, it seems to be more about age appropriateness, whereas for tobacco and marijuana, there is a bit of a change between the ages, but not as much. There's an incredibly strong relationship between attitudinal factors and substance use, as you might expect, but that potentially that's reverse causality, maybe because behaviour's changed, attitudes have changed. And that's not something we can test in a direct way with cross-sectional data, but we did have a look at what's going on for smokers versus non-smokers. So smokers are much more likely to think it's okay for people their age to smoke regularly. But interestingly, even amongst smokers, the attitudes have changed over time. They're much less likely to think it's okay. And finally, I have something that makes a statistically significant difference. So this is, I looked at all the attitudes versus all the behaviours, but this is just looking at attitudes to tobacco use, which do contribute to the trend for smoking, but not only smoking, they also explain some of the trend in marijuana use and quite a lot of the trend in binge drinking. And this is because those behaviours go together, they're very strongly associated with one another. So in conclusion, there's been this marked decrease in risk behaviour since 2000, but not improved mental health, diet or exercise. It's happened in many, but not all high-income countries. Why? Well, we're a long way from having a really definitive answer to that, but it seems very unlikely that it's because healthy has become cool or that young people are healthier in general. It doesn't seem to be about risk aversion. It's possible that shared risk and protective factors like parental monitoring and school factors have played a very minor part, but the big players seem to be delayed initiation and attitude change, particularly to tobacco and alcohol. There are other promising ideas that we're really lacking research, strong evidence about, including the impact of technology, whether financial independence has played a role, whether youth culture and role models have maybe change things. So in conclusion, we know that adolescent risk behaviour has changed dramatically, and we don't know why. And that's a problem because it means that we can't easily build on the public health successes or predict what's likely to happen next. So like a typical researcher, I will conclude that more research is needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jude. That was great. I think we should ban that last phrase, actually. Okay, we've got a little bit of time for questions. If there's people online who want to send questions, we'll try and relay those as well. So any questions, please? Yeah.
Thank you for thanks for a very interesting presentation. One thing that I just want to know if you'd looked at is different cultural groups in different countries and the trends.
Do you mean differences between countries or within countries?
Within countries, and then mapping it out in the countries as well.
I haven't looked in detail except in New Zealand.
And
so as I said, there are big differences by ethnicity and risk behaviour, but the differences seem to be closing over time.
So it'd be interesting to see in Denmark and Italy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Jude, that's a terrific piece of work. A comment, which is usually when the qualitative stuff, which you've done expertly, and I think it's a wonderful presentation, when it doesn't come up with anything plausible, it's a really good stage to do qualitative work or look around, because there's something going on there that people of my age and your age even find it hard to work out what's going on. So I think it calls for more qualitative work. But on the quantitative part, the one part that you didn't mention that I've noticed, and I'd had a talk with Charlotte Paul, I don't know if she's here, who did a really interesting paper on pregnancy, age of first pregnancy, and the Lancet's just had an article about this too, is that there's very significant differences in class and pregnancy, so that while teen pregnancies in general have gone down, that structural pattern has remained. And of course it has huge implications for policy and a whole lot of other things. So could you talk about pregnancy and age of pregnancy?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think the social meaning of pregnancy at age, say, 18 or 19 has really changed. Whereas that used to be normal for any classes. It's now a sign of kind of you're not going anywhere in the world or something. It's not something that I've looked at in detail, and I would be really interested to know whether those differences by class are narrowing as we're seeing with... Are they? Okay. I don't think that's the case in the US. Certainly Black teen pregnancy has dropped dramatically. Hispanic not so much, but there's been a huge decline in Black teen pregnancy. So yeah, good question. I'll have to look into it.
Can I ask a question?
All right.
The attitudinal thing, so as you say, there's this issue of reverse causation, which could actually explain quite a lot of it, because if those behaviours are declining, so the attitudes will be changing as a result of the reverse causation. But sorry, I'm just saying reverse causation could actually explain a lot of that. But the other thing, even if it didn't, or there's some residual factor there, aren't you still left with the question, well, what's causing attitudes to change?
Sure. Yeah, so I had some slides about that, but they didn't make the cut. And I guess the short answer is we don't know, but it's likely to be complex. So attitudes influence what policies are politically feasible, but then once you've got policies, that then impacts on attitudes, behaviour impacts on attitudes, attitude impacts on behaviour. There's all the kind of cultural role models, teen culture stuff. Yeah, I think it's likely to be complex.
One last question. Yeah.
Mine's just a minor question. Thanks so much, Jude. Just a tiny bit of clarification. I might not have quite understood you, but did I get the impression that changes in relation to tobacco use and denormalisation and all that kind of thing, that itself may have been a cause, in some weak sense of the word cause, to attitudes to other risk factors? In other words, obvious changes in tobacco use and tobacco normalisation, and ideas about health and the positive attributes of being tobacco-free. Did I get the impression from you that that may have actually had an effect on other adoption of risk factor behaviours? I might have got it wrong.
It's not impossible. I mean, there could be something about not wanting to put toxins in your body that, that goes across. But I think what I've showed there is a mathematical relationship, because people who smoke are also more likely to be drinkers and marijuana users. The short answer is it's difficult to interpret that mathematical relationship to say, oh, well, this is what's happening in life. We really don't know exactly. So it's a matter of piecing together the puzzles, and I feel like I'm still in the midst of trying to do that.
Okay, well, we're one quick last question.
Jude, I just wanted to ask about young people's attitudes to risky behaviours. So you were talking about how there's high rates of obesity and other, what we in public health would see as poor outcomes due to behaviours that should be discouraged. We might think of risky, eating a lot of junk food or drinking sugary drinks or something. Have you looked at the idea that it's or young people's ideas of what is risky has evolved or has changed? Mm-hmm. Is it changing, or ours have changed, perhaps?
So in the Monitoring the Future study in the US, they ask about perceived harmfulness only of these substances. So it doesn't extend to diet and so on. But the perceived harmfulness of tobacco has gone up enormously over time. But the perceived harmfulness of alcohol has barely changed. And the perceived harmfulness of marijuana has gone down. So people see marijuana as much less harmful than they used to. So there doesn't seem to be a direct mapping of harmfulness onto behaviour.
But there are some behaviours that are increasingly risky, aren't there? Like poor diet, lack of exercise, that are very dangerous. And are they perceived to be?
It's a really good question. Yeah, I don't know of any study that asks that question, but I think it's a really good one. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, we do finish up quick, but if you want to ask Jude afterwards, I'm sure she will. So just three final comments. So thanks everyone for coming along in such large numbers and asking such great questions. Secondly, I just want to make a comment about the sort of epidemiology of this. In public health, we see ourselves as a population-based science, but we hardly ever do this sort of work. And if you look at, for example, in smoking, the number of studies of looking at what are the risk factors for individual smoking, there's hundreds of them. The number of studies that, like Jude's doing, you could count on fingers of one hand or something like that. So it's incredible, really. It goes back to Jeffrey Rose and how he talks about we need to look at the big changes in patterns of disease and behaviours at an ecological and population level. And we very rarely do that, even though as public health we see ourselves as a population-based science. So I think it's great that Jude's done this work. And the third thing I want to say was just what a magnificent talk, and what wonderful how you brought it all together, and I'm hugely impressed with what you've done today, and I just congratulate you on that.